So give me as many contrapuntal terms as you can think of. We've talked about a lot of these already. Just having the ways that you can develop a theme or manipulate a theme. Sequence is something that's a generic kind of element, so it's not so much associated with a contrapuntal technique. But a couple of terms that we've already talked about are diminution, augmentation. So you know what that has to do with. What are some other terms that have to do with fugal writing? So those of you that have had sophomore theory, wrote a fugue, again, what are some things you had to do?
Dukes and colors. I mean, it's not a technique, but the dukes and the colors.
Okay, so that just has to do with canonic or canon. So these are Latin terms. That's the leader, this is the follower, and a canon. And so one of the great works of Bach that uses canons is the great set of variations. It's called Goldberg variations. And this is also from that Leipzig period, so it's from around 1740 or so. It's for harpsichords, for double manual harpsichord. This work takes, if you don't take the repeats, it's almost an hour to play, this work. And every third variation is a canon. Furthermore, if you divide the variation by 3, it will tell you the interval of the canon. So the third variation is a canon at the unison. So variation 6 is a canon at the second. So that means that the leader states a melody, and then the follower enters a measure, a half measure later, at the interval of the second, either above or below the leader. And so this continues all the way to variation 27. What would variation 27 be? It would be a canon at the ninth, right? And so some of these canons are retrograde canons. And so what does retrograde mean? If something is in retrograde, backwards. And so within a canon, a retrograde canon has to do with going in contrary motion. And so this just has to do with melodic inversion. So these are all terms that are contrapuntal terms. We'll put this in parentheses, so this is something that's just a work. Another work that's really important that makes use of lots of contrapuntal writing is the work that's known as musical offering. And this great work was a work that was given to Frederick the Great of Prussia, who was the employer of his son, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. And Frederick the Great was a huge music lover. And so he was a flutist, and he had a huge keyboard collection. And so he wanted Johann Sebastian Bach to come see his keyboard collection. And he had some pianos, which were new types of instruments that Bach tried out. But when he arrived, he wrote this theme, which he gave to Bach, which was very chromatic and would be a hard theme to work with. And he invited him to improvise on this theme. And so Bach improvised a 5-voice fugue on this theme. But then he said, let me take this thing back and work with it, because I think I can, and show you some things. And he presented them this great work that's called the Musical Offering, that's based on this theme that Frederick the Great gave him. But you have in that a retrograde canon, which has this melody that is accompanied by the backwards version of itself. And so they meet exactly halfway through. But if you type into YouTube Bach retrograde canon, you can see some visualizations of this that are pretty cool, that will amaze you at what Bach is able to do as a composer. So really, he just had limitless technique. And so that's basically an overview of his music. So in this section on concerto, we looked at the first movement of the Brandenburg Fifth. He also was important with solo concertos, so he wrote 2 violin concertos, and he wrote several for keyboard. And there are some keyboard versions of works that were thought originally to be for violin. Bach would often use the same melodies for movements of his cantatas, so he would kind of recycle some of his thematic ideas at times. But Bach is the biggest influence of any composer on Western European music, forever after he's died. He's still a huge influence. And so all the great Viennese classical composers knew Bach's music, and then he becomes really popular in the Romantic period. And you start to see actually Romantic composers who will make concert versions of Bach's music. So you start to have transcriptions of his music. It was just the Romantic era that took the attitude that the individual performer was equal to the composer, and they'd make their own versions of these works. So anyway, Bach's music then became very well known and is now regarded as just the greatest representative of that entire era. So the only genre that he didn't compose works in that was important was what? What was the only genre?